Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to another day of Aquarium Online Academy. My name is Sarah. I'm one of the educators here at the Aquarium of the Pacific, and I'm really excited for today's program because we get to talk about a specific habitat, and it happens to be one of my favorite ocean habitats. Now, before we get into what a habitat is and what the habitat we're going to talk about is, I just want to let you know that you can participate in our program this morning. So we have a live text line, and I've got my friends Sergio and Katia helping change everything you see behind me, and they just put up this phone number. Now, this text line, 562-286-1838. That is a live text line. So if you want to say good morning to us, which, well, of course, say good morning back. If you have any questions about this habitat or the animals we're talking about today, if you have any observations you want to share, you can go ahead and text us. That's a live text line, and we can answer your questions or share your observations live on the air. Now, if you are watching after the fact, so it's not today the 6th, I was going to say the 4th, August 6th at 9 a.m., you can go ahead and email us at live@lbaop.org because we still want to be able to answer any questions you have, but we're not always watching that text line if we're not streaming a program. So those are the two ways that you can reach out to us, and we hope to hear from you during today's program. Now, you can see behind me, it kind of looks like we're soaring over a coastline. Now, this is the California coastline. This is a little farther north than where we are. We're here in Southern California, and this is Big Sur, so it's more like towards Central California, but it kind of represents the habitat that we're going to talk about today. Now, I've said that word a couple times, habitat. Can you think for a moment, what is a habitat? Do you know what that word means? We talk about it a lot here at the aquarium, but a habitat is where an animal lives. So there's all different kinds of habitats on land and in the ocean. Now, you might think the ocean is a habitat, and it is, but the ocean is a huge place. And so we can even break it down because if we were to go swimming in the ocean, you'll see different places for animals to live. Some animals need a lot of space and live out in the open ocean. Some animals live where there's sand on the bottom. We call it the sandy bottom. Some animals live in the kelp forest, so those big plant-like algae that grow, create a forest underwater. Some animals live in that habitat. But today we're going to talk about the tide pools. Now, tide pools are a local habitat to us here in California, but they can be found all over along a coastline where there's lots of rocks. Now, I'm going to have Sergio bring up a still picture of a tide pool for us to make some observations and see what we notice about this kind of habitat. So when we see this habitat, we're going to make some observations. Now, observations are a tool that scientists use to help them learn and study something. So you might be very familiar with tide pools. Maybe you've gone and visited them, or maybe this is a brand new habitat that you've never heard of before. We can all make observations because we're just going to look at this picture and we're going to describe what we see or what we notice. And that's going to help us understand what makes up this specific habitat. So take a moment. Remember, you can always text us what your observations are at 562-286-1838. What do you notice about this habitat? What makes up a tide pool habitat? Well, one thing I see, I wonder if you see it too. I see lots of water. Did you see the water too? Excellent. So lots of water, and that is definitely one of the things we need for a tide pool. What else do you see? What are these things right here? And here. And back here. And then even here. Right there. And all the way over here. Rocks, right? There's lots of rocks. So we need rocks for a tide pool. Do you see anything else? Now, you might not notice, but there are living things in this picture too. So we can see down here there's some algae, all this kind of brown stuff. There's probably some animals hiding in here. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And then all this texture you see on the rocks here, and then over here, kind of makes that rock look kind of spiky. Those are animals. Those are both mussels and barnacles, which are two tide pool animals. Now, they are exposed. They're not in the water, but that's okay for a little bit. So animals, lots of different kinds of animals, make up this habitat. Now, I'm going to go over to my document camera for just a moment. And I'm going to write first tide pool. And I think it's helpful. We kind of describe what we saw in the tide pool, but I think it's helpful to break this word down into two words. Because pool might be the more recognizable word. And there are actually two things you need to make a pool, and we kind of noticed them or identified them in our tide pool. But one thing you need is water. And then you need a place to hold the water. And for our tide pool, it's the rocks. So the rocks create a space to hold the water, because if there's no space to hold that water, if we poured water on the ground, it would just spread out, probably dry pretty quickly. It wouldn't be really deep for any animals to live. So that rock creates a container or a space to hold that water, which makes it part of the home for the animals. And then tide is this other part here. Now, you might have heard the word tide, maybe laundry, right? There's Tide laundry detergent, but that's not the kind of tide we're thinking about. We're talking about the movement of water. So I'm going to write movement of water. So we have tides in the ocean. It's the movement of the water. It's connected to the gravitational pull from the moon. We won't get too much into that, but we know that it is connected to that moon and those gravitational pulls. But we do have 2 high tides a day and 2 low tides a day, which means our water level is always changing. Now, I'm going to draw just a really quick tide pool. Here's my rocky coastline. And then I'm going to grab, I think I have a blue. And let's say the water is up here. Now think for a moment. Do you think we would call this high tide or low tide? What do you think? High tide or low tide? Well, if you said high tide, that's correct, because look at all these rocks underneath. These are all covered by the water. So the tide is really, really high. Now, after a couple hours, that water is going to get pulled back out into the open ocean. So the water won't be up here anymore. Instead, it might be down here. Now, do you think we call this high tide or low tide? Oh, let me move that up a little bit. High tide or low tide? Right, it's low tide, because if high tide is when the water's all the way up here, low tide is when it's down here. Now, when the tide goes out, when it's low tide, in all these spaces of the rocks, those are our containers for water. So water might get caught here, it might get caught here, even right here, and right here. And that's what creates those tide pools. So what we're going to look at is who lives in these spaces here when there's low tide. Now, those animals live there when it's high tide, but it's much easier for us to explore them at low tide. And that's one of the reasons that I love tide pools, because they are a local habitat to us here, but they're really easy for anyone who lives near tide pools to access. So you can walk right out onto the rocks. Of course, you want to be careful, wear good shoes, bring a hat and sunscreen, always go with a buddy, so there's some safety precautions. But unlike going like snorkeling or scuba diving or out on a boat where you might need more equipment and it might be a little more expensive, going to the tide pools, you can just walk right out onto the beach and check out those animals that live in the tide pools. Now, you always want to make sure you're going at low tide. So here's a really good look at a rocky coastline, and there's potential for animals in all these spaces. You can see these pools of water, and that's where all these animals live. And so when it's low tide, it's a really great time for us to go explore these animals in their natural habitat. All right, let's take a look at some of the animals who live here. Now, I will tell you that as easy as this habitat is for us to access, it is probably one of the toughest habitats in the ocean for these animals to live in. So actually, before we look at the animals, I want you to think for a moment, why do you think the tide pool, which is easy for us to see and to get to, is such a hard habitat for animals to live in? Look at some of the challenges they might be facing. What do you see crashing here? Exactly, those waves. So wave action is one huge problem or huge challenge. I won't say it's a problem because they definitely need the water movement, but it's a huge challenge for the animals who live in this habitat. They have to deal with these waves crashing over them over and over and over all day long. Now, I want you to think for a moment, and if you have ever been to the beach before, give me a thumbs up. I bet a lot of us have been to the beach before. Okay, I want you to think, when you went to the beach, give me a thumbs up if you went in the water. I've definitely gone in the water. Excellent. Now, one more question. When you went in the water, give me a thumbs up if you got knocked over by a wave. I bet most of us watching who have been to the beach, who have been in the water, have probably got knocked over by a wave before, because that water can be really strong. I mean, look at these waves here. So think about, if we, big humans, get knocked over by these waves, these little animals who live in these pools, they might get knocked over as well. But these animals have to find a way to stay on those rocks, because if they get knocked over, because they're so small, they could get taken out into the open ocean. So these animals have special adaptations or special things on their body that help them live in their habitat, help them survive those challenges. And we'll explore some of those adaptations as we take a look at some of the animals. But before we get there, waves are one challenge, but I want you to think of some other challenges that the animals might face. So we've got the wave action. Think about those barnacles and those mussels we saw on the rocks. And all these rocks, they're exposed. Now, in this video, it doesn't look like it's super sunny. But think about it in the summer, like today or the last week. It's been really hot. And these animals on these rocks, they might be exposed. So another challenge is drying out. Now, we call drying out desiccation. It means basically you lose all the water in your body. But that's just a fancier word for drying out. So these animals definitely have to face the challenge of not only that wave action, but if they get stuck out of water too long, it might be really hot, really sunny, they might dry out. So they have to find ways to either stay wet or hold water in their body when they're out of the water. So that's another challenge, is drying out. What else do you think are some challenges? Think about food. We like to eat food. Those animals like to eat food too. But imagine if you're stuck in a small pool with a lot of other animals. There could be competition for food. Or if you're like those barnacles or mussels and you're on a rock and you're exposed, there are other animals who live at tide pools. Oh, this is a beautiful picture. There are other animals who live around tide pools who might be looking for snacks. And animals who live near tide pools, they know that this tide is going to go low. And they're going to wait for that time to go out to the tide pools to find a snack. Now, some of the tide pools we have here in Southern California, we have foxes who live nearby, we have possums, we have raccoons. So lots of animals who, they're what we call opportunistic feeders. They wait for that opportunity where they know that tide's going to be low, and it's going to make it much easier for them to get their food. So all these tide pool animals have these special adaptations, these special things on their body that are going to help them to survive those waves, to survive drying out, and to survive or prevent themselves from being food for other animals. So now that we've sort of established what a tide pool is, we've talked about some of the challenges that animals face, let's take a look at maybe one of the tide pools that we have here at the aquarium, and we can look at some of the animals and then talk about how these animals survive those challenges. Excellent. So this is our habitat called Coastal Corner here at the aquarium. If you've been here to the aquarium, it's where you can touch all these animals. And yes, you can touch them. If you go to a tide pool, as long as you're really gentle, and we don't want to move animals. We don't want to pull them off the rock, and we don't want to move them from pool to pool. But if you're really gentle, you can touch these animals. So this is here at the aquarium where you can touch them. But these are some of the same animals that we will find in our tide pools here in Southern California and up in Northern California as well. So what animals do you recognize? Or do you recognize any animals? Maybe there's some new things you haven't seen before. If you recognize an animal, you can go ahead and text us what you see at 562-286-1838. Now, something to notice while we're trying to identify or figure out what these animals are is watching their movement or lack thereof, right? We see some movement, but these animals don't move a lot. And that's pretty true for, I'd say, most tide pool animals. I won't say all, because there are some animals who do move quite a bit, but most tide pool animals move very much. You can see up here, this one is kind of waving its body, but its whole body isn't moving. So there's not a lot of movement. And that is actually an adaptation of all the animals in the tide pool who don't move, is they stay put. And that helps them from getting stuck on rocks out of the water. It also helps them to sort of conserve energy, right? They don't move a lot. They're not expending a lot of energy. And so these animals, they stay put. That is one of their adaptations. But if we think about how they stay put, that becomes another adaptation. So let's focus in on one animal. I wonder if you recognize this one. Does everyone know what that is? That's right. That's a sea star or a starfish. We like to call them sea stars because we know that they're not true fish. But if you called it a starfish, that is totally okay. You know exactly what you're talking about. So sea stars are probably one of our most common animals that we find in a tide pool habitat. Now there's lots of different types of sea stars. So this one right here, these are called bat stars. The one that I pointed out before, that one is called an ochre star. There are lots and lots and lots of different types of sea stars. I think here in Coastal Corner, we have something like 7 or 8 different types of sea stars, and there's way more than that in the ocean. But these bat stars and those ochre stars are ones that we commonly find in our tide pool. Now, sea stars might not do much, right? We didn't see that sea star moving. They may not seem like the most exciting or interesting animal, but there's a lot of fascinating things about sea stars. So let's take a look, kind of break it down. What do we notice about our sea stars? I'm going to step off. You can focus on them. What do you notice about our sea stars? I mean, one striking thing is their body shape, right? They get their name sea star for a reason, because they're shaped like a star, which means they have how many arms? Let's count. Let's start with this orange one right here. It's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 arms. Now, most of them have 5 arms. Even in this picture, I have to say most because let's see if you can spot one sea star that has more than 5 arms in here. I'll give you a minute. So that orange one has 5. This orange one has 5. This orange one has 5. I'd say all the orange ones only have 5. But take a look at this pink one right here. Let's count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. 6 arms. So while most sea stars have 5 arms, and bat stars definitely should have 5 arms, but every so often we'll see 6 arms. We even occasionally see 4 arms for our bat star. But there are some sea stars that have way more arms than the bat star. There's something called a sunflower star. Here we got a beautiful picture of a sunflower star. And sunflower stars, they're one of the largest sea star species. They can get like this big. Those bat stars are only like this big, but those sunflower stars can get much, much larger. And they can have up to like 23 arms. I won't spend the time counting. That'll take us too long. But they can have about 23 arms. There's also a sun star, which is a little bit smaller than a sunflower star, and they tend to have like 8 or 10 arms. So while most have 5, there are some variability with some that have more arms than our bat star. So we notice their arms and their shape. What else do you notice? I mean, I was naming the different colors, right? So sea stars can be a rainbow array of colors. There's even more colors than we see here. We also have blue sea stars. There's sort of brownish green sea stars. Sea stars come in all different colors. Now, for our bat stars specifically, they come in all these different colors, but we don't really know why they come in different colors. They all live in the same place. All these sea stars are eating the same food. So we just think there's some genetic variation that changes the color of them, even though they're all living in the same place, eating the same thing. So sea stars not only have 5 arms, but they can be rainbow colors. But let's flip a sea star over and see what it looks like underneath. Excellent. So this is another kind of sea star, and this one is on the glass of its exhibit. So whereas those bat stars were flat, this one is kind of up against the exhibit. And we are looking at the underside of its sea star. So what do you notice? You see all those polka dots? Yeah, so it's got all these little polka dots all along its arms. Now, those aren't just fancy polka dots, like different pattern on its body. Those are actually called tube feet. They're not 2 feet, but tube feet, because it's like a little tube. And those are how the sea star moves around. It's also how the sea star hangs onto the rocks so well, so when they get hit by those waves, they're not moving anywhere. So one of the sea star's adaptations, one of the things that help them survive in their habitat, is they have these suction cups, these sticky, sticky feet. They can stick onto rocks, and it helps them hold on really tight. I wonder if we have a video or picture or video of them moving. Excellent. So this is even another kind of sea star. This one is called a giant spine star, or I've heard it called a jeweled star or a knobby star. But name aside, you can see all of their tube feet. So all of these things, I think they kind of look like macaroni noodles. They kind of feel like wet noodles too. But those are their suction cup feet that help them move and help them hold on. So you can see them sticking. If you look kind of right here. So what they'll do is they'll fill a tube with water, and then it creates a seal when it reaches onto a hard surface. And then they'll use the next arm, and they'll create a seal, and then they'll lift this one, and they keep going as they move along. And that helps them not only to walk, but also to hold on really tight. And they have quite a bit of grip strength. They can hold on really tight that it's hard to pull them off, which is good because they don't want to get pulled off. Now, not only do those feet help them move and help them hold on, they can also do something else with their feet. Now, it might sound kind of weird because we have a nose to do this thing. So we use our nose to do what? We use it for 2 things, really. Our nose is used to breathe, very important, right? Sea stars are not using their feet to breathe, but they're using it to do the other thing our nose is used for. We use our nose to smell, right? So we might be able to smell food cooking in the kitchen, or at a restaurant we can smell food, or maybe something kind of smells bad, we can tell because we can smell it. But sea stars, they're using their feet to smell, and they're smelling for their food. That's the main thing they're smelling for, is to find their food. Because sea stars, they have eyes, but their eyes don't work very well. We call them eye spots because they really can only see light and dark, so it doesn't help them find their food. So instead, they need to use those suction cup feet to smell for their food. Now, you might be wondering what smells so good in the ocean that they're eating. Well, it's an animal we already mentioned before, a mussel. So I'm going to grab a mussel shell, put it on my camera so I can show you what it looks like. So this is half of a mussel shell. So it would have another half on the other side. Here's the inside, but I only have one. But this animal has two shells stuck together. Now the star doesn't want to eat the shell. It wants that squishy animal on the inside. But it is going to use its sticky feet to smell for that food. And then when it finds that mussel, it's got to eat it. But here's where the sea star keeps getting more interesting, is the way that it eats. So once the sea star finds the mussel, they then have to open up that shell. Now, they sort of have arms. They don't really have hands like us. They don't use tools. What they actually do is they use those suction cup feet and they hug their food. Do you hug your food before you eat it? Sometimes we might want to because we're so excited to eat, but we would get it all over our clothes. So we don't hug our food, but the sea star takes all their arms, they wrap them around that mussel, and then they pull really hard using those sticky feet to open up the mussel. And then once they open up the mussel, they can get to that squishy animal on the inside. So here we can kind of see their mouth is going to be right here in the middle. You can also see their sticky feet. So once they get that mussel open, then they're ready to eat it, but they don't eat it the same way we did. If you had breakfast this morning or snack, you put the food in your mouth, you chewed it up, you swallow it, it goes to your stomach. That's not what sea stars do. Sea stars start with their stomach. They pull it out of their body. They put it into that shell where their mussel is. They have acid in their stomach, which we have acid in our stomach too. It helps break down our food. So it breaks down that mussel, and then they pull their stomach back into their body, and that's how they eat their food. So it's pretty much the opposite of us. They pull out their stomach to eat their food rather than putting the food in their mouth to go down to their stomach. And this picture right here, this is a sea star called a chocolate chip sea star, because if we were to look on the other side, it looks like it's got chocolate chips covering it. But what we can see here is their stomach. So this sort of yellow goopy thing right here, that is their stomach as they pull it out of their body to eat. Excellent. Now, there's a lot of really cool things about sea stars. There's even more, but I'm not going to keep going about sea star because I want to talk about at least one or two more tide pool animals, because this program is all about the tide pool itself. But I encourage you to keep learning about sea stars because I didn't even share all the fascinating things that happen to sea stars or that sea stars can do. Excellent. Now we're back in our tide pool. What other animals do you see? I see 3 or 4 animals, but 2 more animals that I want to talk about before we finish our program today. And one of them is that one I pointed to right here that looks like it's kind of waving. Does anyone know what that animal is? There's a bunch of them in here. So believe it or not, this is the same one. Same kind of animal. This is the same kind of animal. Even this thing right here is the same kind of animal. This one, this one, this one. So just like the sea stars, there's different types of sea stars. This animal, which is a sea anemone, there are different kinds of sea anemones. So this one up here is called a fish-eating anemone. This one down here is a green anemone. There's painted anemones. There's rose-spotted anemones. That's this one right here. So lots of different kinds of anemones. But let's take a closer look at what an anemone is. Excellent. This is a great picture. So let's make some observations of this animal. It is an animal. Sometimes people say it kind of looks like a flower or a plant, so we call them plant-like animals, but it is an animal. What do you notice? So it's got some different colors, right? This red part down here, this is sort of like the stalk, sort of like the part that we see kind of going up on the animal. And that is sort of a round space, and that's going to hold all their organs. So in here is where all their organs are. And then we've got some white. These are their tentacles. And then this is part of their body too, this yellow. And then this middle here, that circle, that is their mouth. Excellent. So I'm going to pause on our anemone really quick because we got a question from Luke. And Luke would like to know how sea stars breathe, which is an excellent question because I said they're not breathing with their feet or their noses. So sea stars, they actually are going to take the oxygen out of the water. Now, how are they getting water in their body? Great question. So if you can see, I'm going to try and spot it on these sea stars. They have something called a madreporate, which I think on this sea star is right here. There's a little sort of spot on the top of sea stars. Every sea star has it. And if you go to an aquarium or you're at a tide pool, you'll be able to see that madreporate, that hole on the top of the sea star, because it looks different from the rest of the part of their body. It's pretty small, but it is a significant spot on the top of the sea star. And here we go. Let's see where we can spot the madreporate. Sometimes it is hard to see, but there is a spot on the top of our sea star. Usually it's like off to the side, maybe around here. And what that madrepore does is it pulls water into the body of the sea star. Now, as humans, we have blood that circulates through our body and that helps us move and stay alive. Sea stars don't have blood. They have what's called a water vascular system, which just means that the way blood moves through our body, sea stars have water moving through their body. And it's all pulled in through that madrepore, that hole on the top. I actually think the madrepore is this little spot right here. It's kind of circular. It's kind of a little bit of a different color. But they're able to pull water in through their body, and that helps them move those sticky feet, those tube feet. It helps them move their arms. It also helps them filter water through their body so they can take oxygen out of it to help them breathe. So that's a great question, Luke. Thanks for sending it in. Sea stars are pulling water in through the top of their body. They're filtering water through to help them move, and they're also taking the oxygen out, allowing them to breathe. Excellent. All right, keep those questions coming. I know we only have a couple minutes left, but any questions, even if we have to go back to sea stars or tide pools or any other animal, we love hearing your questions. So back to our anemone. They have their mouth in the very middle, and then these tentacles here are really important because those tentacles have stinging cells in them. Anemones are relatives of jellyfish. So just like jellies have stinging cells, anemones have stinging cells too. Now, I think it's kind of interesting to compare sea stars and anemones because they're very different animals. Sea stars are flat. So think about it. Being flat, when they get hit by waves, they're pretty flat to the rock, and so it doesn't really bother them. Their bodies are pretty hard. They're not super, super flexible, but being close to the rock, it doesn't hurt their body as much. Now, anemones, they can be a lot taller. They kind of stick up off the rock. So imagine getting hit by a wave. It might hurt their body just like we can get knocked over. But the interesting thing about anemones is they have no bones in their body. They have nothing hard in their body. So even though they might stick out more on the rocks and get hit by waves, they're very flexible and they move with the water. They sort of wiggle their body and they move wherever the water pushes them. And so those waves don't actually hurt their body the way that it might knock us over if we were to stand up in a wave. So that's why I think it's kind of interesting looking at sea stars versus anemones. But our anemone, they also sometimes use a suction cup to hold on. Some anemones will suction on. Some anemones will glue themselves to the rock. Just depends on the type of anemone. Oh, but here we go. So you can see that sort of long body. This is where all their organs are. And you can see this anemone moving in the water. So it's really flexible and fluid and it just kind of goes where the water pushes it. And so it isn't harmed by the waves the way that maybe something that's really rigid would if they tried to stick out from a rock and got hit by those waves over and over. It might break that thing that's sticking out if that thing can't move with the water. Now, those tentacles are really important because it's not only how they protect themselves, it's also how they catch their food. So I mentioned that they're kind of plant-like animals. So animals like small fish or shrimp might think they're swimming through some plants, but instead they're really swimming through these tentacles, and that's how the animal catches their food and brings it into their mouth. All right, we've got 2 minutes left. Let's go back to one more animal. Let's take a look at our tide pool. So the last animal we're going to talk about is this one all the way over here. You see this animal right here? Maybe you even missed it because it almost kind of blends in with this sea star. But this animal right here is a relative of the sea star, but it's pretty different. This one is called a sea urchin. Now, sometimes you hear sea urchin and sea anemone, and those words kind of get mixed up because they're both animals who live in the tide pool, but they're pretty different animals. So anemones are the ones that kind of wave in the water with those stinging tentacles. Sea urchins are these spiky ones. Let's see if we get, right there, can get a picture of a sea urchin. Excellent. Now, this is a purple sea urchin, and just like those anemones and those sea stars, they come in all different colors. Here along our coast, the most popular we see are purple sea urchins and red sea urchins, but our oceans have black sea urchins, green sea urchins, pink, white. I think those are the ones I know of. But lots of different colors that our sea urchins come in. Now, what do you notice about this animal? Now, it's not quite as long or sticking up off the rock as the anemone, but it's not quite as flat as a sea star. But it has spikes covering its body. Now, that might be alarming, thinking stay away from that animal. And that is the point of having those spikes, is it keeps other animals away. But I'm here to tell you a secret that these purple sea urchins are actually really nice animals. If you see a purple sea urchin here at the aquarium or at a tide pool, you can gently touch them as long as we're gentle, and they don't hurt us. They're not trying to poke you with their spikes. They're just trying to keep other animals away from eating them by looking really spiky. When we touch their spines, they kind of feel like toothpicks or like the tip of a pencil. So they are kind of sharp, but they're not going to poke you with it unless you were to kind of smash your hand on it or step on it, which is why we need to make sure that we're always being really gentle with the animals that we're touching if we're touching animals at a tide pool. But not only do the sea urchin have spikes, they also have tube feet, just like the sea star. So the way that they hold onto the rocks and the way that they move are using those long, sticky feet. Now, they kind of are even thinner than the ones for a sea star, but they almost look like hairs when they're kind of floating in the water. But they use suction cup feet. Oh, here we go. We can see them. They're kind of all over their body, but they use them to move around, and they also use them to hold onto their food, which was kelp, what that sea urchin was sitting on before. So they use those sticky feet to hold on. That's one of their adaptations, just like the sea star. All right, friends. I mentioned before that I love the tide pool, and I could keep talking about tide pool animals for a very long time, but we are out of time. So I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about this habitat, about what makes a tide pool, what are some of the challenges to the animals that live there, and then learning about sea stars, anemones, and urchins, some of the animals we do find in a tide pool. All right, everyone, I hope you have a good rest of the day. If you're looking for more programming, we have another program coming up at 10. It's in Spanish, and it's all about sharks. Hope to see you then.